Now, another one has just dropped. 5 days ago, I showed you this video where a Russian general said, essentially, we're wrong. We thought that 70% of the Ukrainian people would come out and back us, and they would be essentially behind us fighting. Okay, so remember, the Russians thought that in 3 days they would essentially take Kyiv. In 3 weeks, they would mop up. Zelensky would flee or be killed, and then they would be able to have Ukraine under their authority and under their rule. It would be the Ruski Mir would be spread into Ukraine as it should be in the Russians' perception. Well, they were wrong. And 4 years later, almost 4 years later, here we are. So another Milblogger just went off script. This is a popular Russian Milblogger goes off script, blaming the regime for lies that brought them into war. Now, why are lies happening? Because, well, when you're in an authoritarian system, the truth doesn't tend to trickle up, right? If you get in trouble for telling the boss the truth, then maybe you want to shed the truth for some kind of reimagined version of it and spread that up the chain, right? Okay, so Z-blogger Alexei Leonkov, a Russian military expert, an analyst, blogger, and editor of the magazine Arsenal Olchevska, Arsenal of the Fatherland, is here being interviewed. And he says this, it's pretty incredible to watch. He says this, I saw the so-called victory analytics claiming that 98% of Ukraine's population would welcome us with open arms. Okay, so again, this is what they expected was going to happen. This is exactly the kind of thing that they expected. Now, the Russians, as I understand it, so there were Russians training in Belarus and doing these wargaming kind of scenarios in Belarus, and they were doing this. Biden is warning that there's a military buildup on the border because our intelligence is looking at that going like, this is way too much for what's going on. He's just saying, don't invade Ukraine. We can see what you're going to do. They try to put it out there. And now, as I understand it, only Putin and a few of his closest generals knew that the invasion was actually going to happen and it was going to be an invasion. And the invasion was actually kind of geared to blitz over a larger area. The invasion was kind of, it came from all different directions. It wasn't focused. It was coming in from Belarus. It was coming in from Russia and Russia and Russia. It was coming up through Crimea. And it was like from all different directions intending to just overwhelm the Ukrainians. And then Zelensky had the famous comment when he's asked, like after they cross over the border, Zelensky's famous comment was, I need ammunition, not a ride, right? And so that's what was happening there. And he didn't flee. He stood and fought. And the Russians weren't counting on a figure like Zelensky actually staying to fight. They were counting on him fleeing, taking over pretty easily, not blowing the bridges on the way to Kyiv, or the people coming out in droves to like defend their own homes and their cities. But they got the calculation all wrong. They calculated all wrong because of exactly what this guy's saying here, that they had wrong information. That general said it last week. He's still alive to my knowledge, but he said it last week. And then we see this guy saying, again, I saw the so-called victory analytics claiming that 98% of the Ukrainian population would welcome us with open arms. That analysis was fundamentally wrong and completely different from what Ukraine's allies were saying. Right? Like, you could have gotten that information elsewhere had you been looking. Ukraine's allies were saying clearly that 92% of Ukrainians did not consider Russia a friendly state. Now, okay, so this is kind of mind-blowing to, and please forgive me if you've heard this before, but I'm trying to explain, and not everybody's heard it. This is kind of mind-blowing to Russians because Russians think about Ukrainians as Russians. They're just us, but they have this mind virus going on of this political thing called Ukraine that makes them think that they're somehow different than us. They're one people with us. Now, they're a little bit lesser people. They're from the borderlands is the way that they think about it, or they're little Russians, but they're still Russians. They're essentially the same stuff. They're just the, class B people, not the same as us, but they're still Russians. And so if they are Russians and they're doing what they're doing here, they're traitors against Russia, and they need to either be, because they're traitors, they need to be either exterminated if they won't shed their ways, or they need to be re-educated. That's what they're doing with Russian children, or not Russian children, Ukrainian children who are being exported to Russia, trained and brainwashed essentially in order to be good little Russians, right? This is a twofer too, because they have a population. I talked about this in the last couple of days. Putin lamenting the population crisis that they have there, and so they're dealing with the population crisis by stealing Ukrainian children. And it's not just stealing Ukrainian children. There's only like 20,000 that we're sure of, probably 35 to 40,000 that are more likely. But then there's all those areas that are now Russian oblasts where they're doing the same kind of re-education too. And in a generation, they'll have a new Russian army that's built on, well, Ukrainians. Okay, now, all that to say, the way that the Russians see Ukrainians is that we're one people. It's a brotherly civil war conflict. They're trying to export that myth to the West, but Ukrainians don't see it that way. Ukrainians see that they've been fighting for their independence for all of their existence, and they're a different people. They speak a different language. They don't want to have the Russians. They remember the Holodomor, right? So that's where the Ukrainians are at the same time. So with this, let's go back to this here, where he's saying, I saw the Victory Analytics claiming that 98% of Ukrainian population would welcome us with open arms. That analysis was fundamentally wrong, completely different from what Ukrainian allies were saying. They stated clearly 92% of Ukrainians did not consider Russia a friendly state. What was launched as a so-called political operation was meant as one from the start. What do you mean a political operation? So it was supposed to be overwhelm them, and then it becomes the government flees, and then you just set up shop. There were reports of military that had their dress uniforms, like they were ready for parades and all kinds of ceremonies and things like that. They weren't coming to fight; they were coming to occupy. He says this was really meant as a political one. I know for a fact that in 2022, the National Guard was sent into the combat zone equipped with plastic shields, gears for urban patrolling. That's not the kind of things that they should have been sent into if they were planning to actually occupy Ukraine. I mean, if they were planning to actually fight in Ukraine, not just occupy Ukraine as a cleanup aftermath. Okay. The army had been told that the operation would unfold this way. When it became clearer that the reality was different, urgent decisions should have been made immediately. Yeah, it should have been made immediately, but it wasn't made immediately. And this guy, a Milblogger, was telling the truth. And again, it goes right back to the same kind of thing that this general was saying, that we thought that the Ukrainians would back us, and they were surprised. It was poorly planned, poorly executed, and here we are, well, almost 4 years later. All right, last little bit. It's part of this is the system. The system in which Putin sits is a system where truth doesn't necessarily make it to his level. Sometimes he's spouting lies. Sometimes he's just repeating what he thinks is true that's been told. But again, from the Soviet era, Alexander Solzhenitsyn says, we know that they're lying. They know that they're lying. They know that we know that they're lying. We know they know they are lying, but they're still lying. Okay, well, that's where we are. Tell me what you thought about what you saw here, my friends. I'm curious about, how you're digesting this. Is this making sense to you? Put that in the comments below. I try to read as many as I can. Thank you for the time, the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person who cares about Ukraine.